Howdy, y'all, and welcome to Coach Clucker's Classroom. Today, we're going to be talking about the 70s in U.S. history. So, coming out of World War II, President Nixon and having to deal with the Cold War era politics, him and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who we'll talk a lot about, are going to try and improve the relationship with Russia to try and get the Soviets to help in the Vietnam War. So Nixon and Kissinger both agree that they need to have a fresh start between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Not as viewing them as political enemies, but as trading partner, and that both nations could benefit if they were to be trading. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence in the 70s that a global communist movement was on the rise. There were just a few nations influenced by Russia, the USSR, and China. And so, with Nixon coming to office, he is the first president to officially recognize China as a nation. Now, when the Chinese had their communist revolution, the non-communist government at the time was exiled to the island of Taiwan and had been ruling from there. And so tensions were always high from Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. So Nixon comes in, he's the first president to effectively recognize the communist Chinese government. Knowing the great manufacturing power that could be brought, he realized that China can't be ignored and that it's best that a trade agreement would be created. A side hope was that the Chinese would stop supplying the North Vietnamese or help pressure the North Vietnamese into suing for peace during the Paris Treaty. So, not having a whole lot to lose, Nixon's going to push forward with his plan. He is going to allow the American table tennis team to be invited over to China to play versus the Chinese. This is portrayed in the 30-second scene with Forrest Gump playing table tennis in what is supposed to be his amazing life. There are several other movies that have definitely portrayed that trip. In 1972, Nixon makes a trip to meet with the Premier of China and Chairman Mao Zedong. And so it's one of the high points of his presidency. He goes to China, he comes back, and the relationship is steady, it's reliable, and Americans are starting to visit China, and trade can start happening after his trip. So Nixon has this policy known as Détente, the idea of friendliness with China. He wants to help use China and build a relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that if China was more on the side of the U.S. through trade, that Russia would ease off. And so, not long after his trip to China, he'll be invited to Moscow, and he'll be the first president to go to the USSR and engage talks with their premier at the time. They held a summit, basically a meeting, to talk about signing a treaty known as Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The idea that they're going to limit the amount of productions of IBMs and weapons. And so these two superpowers, these two sleeping giants, usher in a new era known as of peaceful coexistence, that each nation is going to limit the amount of weapons they produce. And so this is going to help ease tensions of America not thinking that there's going to be a global conflict with them and Russia. So he's going to sign measures on the American domestic side of things, increasing food stamps and Social Security with the inflation caused by the Vietnam War. He will push affirmative action, which gives minorities special consideration in fields for education, college enrollment, and for employment to make up for past discrimination. And so during his first presidency, the number of Southern blacks attending college and integrated schools goes from 32% to 77%. He's also going to pass the Title IX and the Education Amendments, which bans gender discrimination in education programs and activities. This is how in modern high schools we have a male's team and a female's team. For every male sport, there must be a female sport. But there is some tension in the 70s at this time. In 1973, the Supreme Court made the decision on Roe v. Wade to legalize abortion, and that states could not ban abortion after just 3 months. And so many Americans felt that this was violating their religious freedom. We also get in 1972 a court case of Wisconsin versus Yoder, which ruled that Amish children did not have to attend school past the 8th grade due to religious beliefs, and that because Amish way of life, there's not many educational needs beyond the 8th grade if they choose to stay in that community. So we talked a little bit in previous videos about the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW, pushing for gender equality. Women had been entering the workforce primarily dominated by men. And so NOW is going to start pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, which would be a constitutional amendment to guarantee gender equality under the law. Unfortunately, while this bill is passing Congress and had 35 of the 38 states needed to pass it in order to become national law, conservatives like Phyllis Schlafly are going to work hard to kill this bill. And one of the main arguments that are used to kill this bill was that the Vietnam War is at the height of its intensity and that they didn't want women eligible for the draft, and women would be if they were having an equal rights amendment. Women would be eligible for the draft, and Phyllis Schlafly was going to fight against that. They believe that was going to hurt women and the domestic family role at the time. And so the Equal Rights Amendment will not become a constitutional amendment. There are other worries on the domestic side in the 70s under the environment. We will create Earth Day to be held on April 20th to help show worldwide support for environmental protection. Congress will also create the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to help clean up environments and limit pollutants that cause health problems in an effort to save the earth for future generations. With that, we also get acts such as the Clean Air Act, limiting emissions from factories and cars, the Clean Water Act, limited the amount of pollution into water, the Endangered Species Act, to protect animals and plants, problems didn't just stop at the economy. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, a supra multinational organization that is made up by countries selling oil are going to rise prices by 70%. Part of this is due to a brief war that's breaking out, and OPEC's gas prices will soar through the roof. Another point of tension for this is that the nation state of Israel is going to be engaged in some conflict with some of the countries in OPEC, Egypt and Saudi Arabia specifically. And because of this, they will organize an embargo, or rather, they will stop selling oil to the United States because the U.S. supports Israel. The rising gas prices are going to cause unemployment to spike as people cannot travel around. And so we start shifting from large cars such as Vista Cruisers and Oldsmobiles to more fuel efficient cars made overseas. Now, with Nixon rerunning for office, he's going to win in a landslide victory over McGovern, only losing one state. Now, with this, Nixon was very paranoid of how his enemies were going to get ahead of them, what they had, what weapons were they planning to use. And so during the election, 5 employees of his campaign are going to break into the Watergate Hotel, the Democratic headquarters at that time, and arrest and steal plans. When they are arrested and go to the trial, no one really knew what they were there for. They thought they were there to steal plans, but not much evidence was recovered. And it comes out that they were installing listening devices or wiretaps to listen in onto what was being said in the Democratic HQ headquarters. And so the president had uncovered, someone had uncovered that someone close to the president had ordered them to break in and sabotage the Democratic Party. It was later known that Nixon had knowledge of this and had recorded those meetings. The unfortunate thing is that the Democratic Party had absolutely no plans. Like, they were in utter shock and disarray during this election. There was no realistic chance they were going to win. And he still was so paranoid that he ordered employees of his to break into the hotel. So with Watergate at the front of American news at home, his vice president is going to resign from office because of an unrelated tax fraud and bribery conspiracy. And so, according to the 25th Amendment, which deals with presidential succession, Nixon nominated Gerald Ford as his new vice president. No one ever voted on Gerald Ford, either in office or at a ballot box. And so Gerald Ford becomes the new vice president for the United States. Nixon is going to be asked to hand over the tapes, and he's going to say that there is a quote-unquote executive privilege where the president can keep some information confidential, and that if he was to just turn over everything ever said, no one would ever come and bring their problems to the president. And so it would take over a year, but eventually the tapes will be turned over to Congress. And so week after week, more information is going to come out, and it's going to damage the reputation day after day, week after week of the Watergate scandal. He knew of the break-in. He authorized them to be payment, asked them to commit perjury and lie under oath. He ordered the FBI to stop investigating. And so the House of Representatives will recommend that he's impeached. But before his support is completely gone, before he is officially impeached by the Congress and Senate at the time, he is going to resign from office. Now, I guess they could have still impeached him after he resigned and left office. I don't understand why him resigning would stop impeachment. If we look at 2020 with President Trump losing the election but still being impeached after office when he's out of office, what would be the point? And so they stopped the impeachment of President Nixon, but it damages the president's reputation and the confidence that people have in the government. Just like Warren Harding in the 1920s when the Teapot Dome scandal opened up, revealing that they had sold oil to a friend of a friend who was a political ally, then he lost major popularity. President Nixon went on national television time after time and said, I am not a crook. I did not do this. I had no knowledge of it. And time after time, it was shown that he did, and trust evaporated. After he resigned, surveys show that only 1 out of 3 Americans believe what the government told them. So when Agnew resigns as president, Ford gets picked as VP. President Richard Nixon resigns, and Gerald Ford is taking up office. His first thing he did was he pardoned Nixon. I guess this would probably be the reason why the impeachment did not continue. Ford is going to urge Americans to shop wisely, save money, not to spend lots of money on gasoline for the oil embargoes that we've just talked about. And he's going to hit major kudos when he signs the Helsinki Accords. So he recognizes, hey, borders in Europe have changed since World War II. We have to acknowledge there's human rights and some of the freedoms in Eastern European countries by the communists. And he'll get major kudos for signing an agreement with the Soviets. So Ford finishes out the term and he does not run. Well, he does run, kind of. And for the first time ever, voters get to choose whether they want Gerald Ford in office. And Jimmy Carter is going to defeat Ford. Now, he used Watergate, he used Vietnam to produce the idea that Americans were struggling, the government was struggling in controlling issues. As a devout Baptist, he promised the Americans he was not going to lie to them, and some of his goals to make the U.S. a better place. So Jimmy Carter will be elected into office, defeating the only president who was never voted on. And Jimmy Carter is going to view inflation, the cost of living, as the biggest problem, not the lack of jobs. So he cuts the spending on domestic programs, thinking that competition will reduce prices, and it does for a short amount of time. He also believes that nuclear energy would reduce our dependence on foreign oil. However, after a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, which was not as large as Chernobyl, it still garnered much attention, and many Americans became fearful of using nuclear energy after this. Another problem with Carter in office is the US and Russia's stance on Afghanistan. The Soviets will stage a coup in Afghanistan to install a communist government. Thousands of troops will pour into Afghanistan. Afghanistan will effectively become a Vietnam type situation for the Soviets. And Carter pledged that he's going to protect the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, protect where most of the oil is in the Middle East. In response to the Soviets invading, though, it's never just enough to have a political disagreement. You must also make it a social disagreement. And so the U.S. decides to boycott the Moscow Olympics and stop buying food from the USSR and instead use that money to fund fighters in Afghanistan, specifically the Taliban, who we gave much equipment to and many guns to. So, with Afghanistan, the oil crisis in America, Carter is also going to try and improve the relationship with Cuba. If you remember from the Cold War, Cuba becoming a communist nation with Fidel Castro announced that Cubans could migrate to the United States, but he also wanted to send to America Cuba's prisoners. And so Carter is going to agree to this. It was not widely controversial for him to accept Cuba's prisoners, as many of them were pro-democracy political prisoners. His most controversial decision, the one that probably got him lost and lowered his opinion among most Americans, was returning Panama Canal back to the Republic of Panama. So we remember from our imperialism video, Teddy Roosevelt started the canal in 1900, completed it 14 years later, and it literally cut off over half the amount of travel needed to go from San Francisco to New York, because instead of sailing around South America, you can now sail through the canal. And so the Panama Canal provided economic boost to the United States with money, but it was also strategic importance for the Cold War. And so Carter giving away the Panama Canal and returning it was viewed as a mistake by most Americans. As we've talked about, the U.S. was having an oil embargo because we backed the nation state of Israel. Dating back to World War I, the Ottoman Empire controlled the area, but when they are defeated, the British and the French take possession of the territory. Israel, known as Palestine at the time, controlled by the British, was decided to be the home for a Jewish nation after World War II. There weren't many options for where the Jews could go. Some said they would send them to Siberia or Alaska, parts of Brazil, or Madagascar were options that were thrown out for possible homelands, but it was decided to make Palestine the home for a Jewish nation. And so they were, after World War II, Muslim nations are going to originally approve of the Jews coming to Israel until they realized that the Jews now made up the majority in the region, and then began to call for a Jewish state, specifically against the Muslims. And so in 1947, the United Nations offered partition deals to form two countries, an Arab nation and a Jewish nation, and the Muslim nations are going to reject this offer. Since they are not agreeing to the deal, the Jews are going to declare the whole new state of Israel in 1948. And while Truman recognizes it, it takes less than a year for the neighboring Muslim countries to attack and war to follow. After 1948, there's a short period of peace. In 1967, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan attack, and within 6 days, Israel conquers all three of those nations. 6 years later, it took another invasion on the holiday of Yom Kippur, and it took Israel 3 weeks to defeat Egypt and Syria again, further repelling those invading the Jewish state. So with all the tension in Egypt and Israel, Syria, Jordan, in the Middle East, we will orchestrate the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel to come to the United States to negotiate a peace treaty. They will meet at Camp David, and while it was a tough agreement at the time, Egypt will be the first country to recognize Israel, and Israel will officially remove its troops from Egyptian land. But that isn't the only crisis in the Middle East that the U.S. faces. So with signing a peace treaty and orchestrating that in Israel, on the other side of the Middle East, Iran, a major supplier for American oil and American arms buyers, is going to have a revolution. They will overthrow the Shah, the king of Iran, because the citizens feel that he's become a puppet of the United States and is controlled by the president. And so they will elect or choose the Ayatollah Khomeini to overthrow Iran and declare Iran as an Islamic republic. The Shah, being sick, will come to the U.S., which will further strain tensions between the U.S. and Iran. During the Iran crisis, the revolutionaries will storm and seize the American embassy. They will seize 66 prisoners, but release the women and children, lowering the number to 52. And so we will orchestrate Operation Desert Eagle to try and rescue the prisoners at the embassy. However, this is a failure. And so 52 Americans are kept in the embassy, going through mental extremes of captured. And so the public is now viewing Carter as incompetent and incapable. The hostages are going to stay in captivity for 444 days, over a year, until Carter loses his last election, which can be boiled down to his inability to recover the captives from the embassy and his decision to give the Panama Canal back to Panama. So in 1980 election, Ronald Reagan, a Hollywood movie star who was once claimed to be a communist, comes into office hoping and saying he's going to restore America to a dominant role in the world. Carter, having the lowest approval rating of any American president ever to date at 21%, lower than President Nixon after the Watergate scandal. Reagan is going to come in and win the White House in a sweeping victory, 489 to 49. It was not long into Reagan's presidency that Iran will release the hostages from the embassy, and Reagan will be seen as a hero solving an issue that Carter was incapable of. That's all for the 70s. Thank you for stopping by Coach Cloaker's Classroom. Until next time, I love you, and I'm proud of you.